In addition to these organized pastimes, daily life had its own rhythm. At dawn, the bugle call echoed across the compound, stirring the women from sleep. Frost sometimes coated the barrack roof, even in Texas. The women dressed quickly, folded their blankets with military precision, and swept the floor. After roll call, they marched to breakfast under a sky streaked with pink and orange. The path from their barracks to the mess hall took them past the men's compound, where loud voices and laughter spilled over the fence. They kept their eyes forward. After eating, they washed their tin plates in metal tubs and returned them to the cooks. Work details followed. On some days, the women sorted through piles of mail, organizing letters and packages sent to thousands of prisoners. On other days, they mended torn uniforms with thread and needles provided by the camp store. Every task had a purpose. In the late afternoon, they were allowed free time. Some walked the perimeter of their compound, counting steps. Others sat on the barrack steps and wrote in diaries they had made from scrap paper. A few lay on their bunks and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and thinking about home. The routine was relentless, but within its boundaries, the women created small spaces of agency. Night brought stillness. After lights out, whispered conversations traveled down the rows of bunks. Women told stories about childhood, about brothers at the front, about villages that no longer existed. They spoke of hunger during the war's final winter in Germany. They confessed fears for the future. Some had nightmares and woke in the dark with their hearts racing. Others lay awake and listened to the sounds of the camp. The distant rumble of a freight train, the chirp of crickets, the occasional bark of a guard dog. One night, the central figure heard music drifting on the breeze. Someone in the men's compound was playing a harmonica, a slow, mournful tune. It reminded her of lullabies her mother had sung. Tears rolled silently down her face. She turned her head and saw other women looking up as well, their expressions softened by the shared memory. In those quiet hours, the prisoners felt both the weight of their captivity and the strength of their resilience. They were still alive. They still had each other. They still possessed minds capable of imagining beyond the wire. One aspect of American life that deeply impressed and perplexed the women was the diversity of the guards. Germany had been a homogeneous society with rigid racial hierarchies. At Camp Hearn, the women saw men of different races wearing the same uniform and performing the same duties. They saw a Mexican-American guard share a cigarette with a white colleague. They saw an African-American sergeant supervising a work detail with authority. They watched as a Jewish chaplain held a service for prisoners of his faith and was treated with respect by his fellow officers. These scenes contradicted Nazi propaganda. They forced the women to question what they had been taught. Some dismissed these observations as exceptions. Others adjusted their worldview. They asked themselves why a country that included people of many backgrounds seemed orderly and prosperous. They wondered if perhaps diversity was a strength rather than a weakness. These questions did not have easy answers, but they planted seeds of doubt about racial doctrines they had accepted without question. Those seeds would grow after the war when they returned to a Europe grappling with its own prejudices. September 1945. Camp Hearn, Texas. The sun hung high above the barbed wire, a white disk in an endless blue sky. Heat shimmered off tin roofs and baked the dusty parade ground. It was early afternoon, just past 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and every sound seemed amplified. Boots crunching on gravel, a distant train whistle, the hum of cicadas. A column of new prisoners shuffled toward the administration building. Among them was a young woman in a threadbare uniform. She was 20, perhaps younger. Sweat darkened her collar. Salt streaks on her cheeks marked the dried tears of a journey that had taken her across continents and oceans. She clutched a canvas duffel and tried to keep her face blank. Her heart pounded. She had been told that American camps were places of humiliation. She had been told that if captured, she would be paraded naked before strangers. The barbed wire fence loomed like a final boundary between her old life and whatever waited beyond. She inhaled the scent of creosote and hot dust and heard the clang of the gate closing behind her. She whispered a prayer, not knowing whether anyone was listening. Months earlier, the war in Europe had ended with the collapse of Germany. Millions of soldiers laid down their arms. In the United States, where more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in about 700 camps, the surrender prompted a logistical challenge. Men captured from the deserts of North Africa, the forests of Italy, and the fields of France were shipped across the ocean. Texas hosted more camps than any other state. Warm winters and flat land made it an ideal place to build stockades. Camp Hearn, near the railroad junction of Hearn, was one of the largest. From 1943 to 1945, it held more than 4,800 prisoners at its peak. Most were men, but among them were several dozen women from auxiliary services. Some were nurses. Others had worked in telephone exchanges or supply depots. By September 1945, when the war with Japan ended, many of these women remained in American custody. They were far from home, thousands of miles from the ruins of Berlin and Hamburg. They did not know what waited for them beyond the fence. The journey to Texas had begun months before. After surrendering in Europe, groups of German women in gray uniforms were herded onto trains. The cattle cars that carried them rattled along tracks, through bombed villages, and across shattered bridges. German officers maintained order inside. American soldiers stood guard outside. They passed through France, where villagers stared with a mix of pity and contempt. At coastal ports, the prisoners were transferred onto Liberty ships. The ships smelled of oil and paint and were overcrowded. Below decks, hammocks were slung above each other like layers of a hive. The women clung to their duffels as the ships rolled across the Atlantic. Seasickness came in waves. The portholes were covered for blackout, leaving the compartment in perpetual twilight. Meals consisted of watery stew and hard bread. When the ship docked briefly in New York Harbor, the prisoners were not allowed to disembark. They glimpsed the skyline through narrow slits and wondered about the people who lived in those towering buildings. They were transferred again to trains, these with cushioned seats and taken west through endless farmland. Outside the windows they saw neat rows of corn and cotton, white wooden houses and tidy barns. In small towns, children waved at the passing cars. In one city, they saw an African-American soldier laugh with a white nurse, a scene that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them about race in the United States. They ate sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and drank coffee from tin mugs. Each mile brought new confusion. This enemy land seemed prosperous and orderly. The fields stretched to the horizon. The women had expected bomb craters and chaos. Instead, they saw abundance. By the time the buses carrying them from the rail siding turned down the dirt road to Camp Hearn, the women were exhausted. The road was lined with cotton fields. Pickers in wide hats moved slowly through the rows, their sacks trailing behind them. Dust rose from the wheels and settled on the canvas covering the bus windows. At the gate, armed guards checked papers and counted heads. Inside, the camp looked like a small town. There were barracks lined up in precise rows, a mess hall, an infirmary, a post exchange, and a chapel. Guard towers rose at intervals along the fence. Floodlights atop the towers pointed inward. The central figure saw other prisoners walking in pairs along the paths, some wearing shorts and undershirts, others in full uniforms. They carried books, pails of water, bundles of laundry. A group of men in work clothes unloaded supplies from a truck. Everything was organized. Everything ran on time. A clock mounted on the administration building chimed every quarter hour. The young woman felt as if she had stepped into a machine. The registration process began immediately. The prisoners were marched into a long building with a sign in several languages, instructing them to keep silence and follow orders. Inside, the air was cooler. Large fans whirred overhead. A chalk line on the floor marked where to stand. A sergeant with a clipboard called out numbers. One by one, the women were led into small rooms. Each was told to undress. The central figure's hands shook as she unbuttoned her tunic. Her mind raced. She thought about the stories she had heard. She expected mocking laughter or groping hands. Instead, a nurse in a crisp American uniform took her clothes and placed them neatly on a chair. She handed the prisoner a bar of soap and a towel and pointed to a shower stall. Water flowed from a metal shower head. It was warm. The woman washed quickly, her cheeks burning with shame even though no one was watching. When she stepped out, the nurse wrapped her in a towel and took her to another room where a doctor waited. He examined her ears, mouth, and chest with professional detachment. He checked for lice and wounds. An orderly weighed her, measured her height, and recorded the information on a card. An army photographer took her picture. She signed a form written in German, English, and French, acknowledging that she understood the rules of the camp. The entire process took less than 30 minutes. She was issued a new uniform labeled PW for prisoner of war, a pair of sturdy shoes, socks, underwear, and toiletries. She received a cloth tag with a number to wear around her neck. She waited for the humiliation, the violence, but it never came. The Americans were efficient and impersonal. They were following a procedure dictated by the Geneva Convention. Outside the intake building, the women were assigned to barracks separate from the men. Each barrack was built of wood, painted in drab colors, with screened windows and a pot-bellied stove for winter heating. Metal bunks lined the walls, each with a mattress, a pillow, and 2 blankets. There were hooks for clothes and lockers for personal belongings. A table and benches stood in the center of the room. A schedule was posted on the wall. Wake up at 6, breakfast at 7, roll call at 7:30, work details at 8, lights out at 10. The routine would be strict. The women would be expected to make their beds, keep their area clean, and sweep the floor. They would march in formation to meals and to work. They would not wander outside their compound without escort. The camp officials explained that failure to obey would result in loss of privileges, but not physical punishment. The central figure listened and wondered if it was a trick. She had grown up in an authoritarian state and understood discipline. She had also seen what happened when discipline turned into brutality. She did not know how to reconcile these new rules with her fears. Within days, she began to see the system at work. Every morning, a bugle call echoed across the camp. The women rolled out of their bunks, dressed quickly, and lined up outside. A German sergeant among the prisoners took attendance and reported to the American Guard. The prisoners marched themselves to the mess hall, where they were served oatmeal, bread, butter, and coffee. Lunch and dinner were hearty meals of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and sometimes fruit. The women discovered that they ate the same food as the American Guards. They noticed that some of the guards were only a few years older than they were. Some were from Kansas or Ohio. One was from Brooklyn and spoke with a thick accent. One guard, an African-American sergeant, smiled at them as he directed them toward the dining hall. He treated them with the same professionalism as the others. This, too, confounded what they had been told. They had been raised on stories of American savagery. They saw discipline and fairness instead. The camp offered work details. Because there were few women, most were assigned to laundry, clerical work, and gardening. In the laundry building, they sorted uniforms, scrubbed shirts on washboards, and fed sheets into wringers. The heat and humidity inside the building were oppressive, but the work gave the women a sense of purpose. The clerical workers filed reports, typed lists, and assisted the camp administration in tracking supplies. They learned the names of American officers and discovered that the camp commandant was a major in his early 40s, with steel gray hair and a habit of checking his watch every few minutes. He spoke basic German and insisted on being addressed formally. In the garden, women planted rows of vegetables, beans, carrots, cucumbers, squash, that would supplement the camp diet. They dug in the rich Texas soil, their fingers working among earthworms and stones. The work connected them to the land in a way that reminded some of home. In the evenings, they returned to their barracks, tired, but with clean clothes and small pay slips for their labor. The camp paid prisoners a token wage in scrip that could be used at the camp store to buy extra soap, candy, or stationery. Education was another part of the system. In Europe, many of the women had been clerks, nurses, or telephone operators. At Camp Hearn, the camp librarian provided them with books. The library contained volumes in German and English, including classics banned in Nazi Germany. It also had magazines, newspapers, and technical manuals. Classes were offered in English, mathematics, and history. Lectures were given by fellow prisoners who had been teachers or engineers. One older woman taught a course in nursing, using a wooden mannequin to demonstrate bandaging techniques. Another taught accounting and basic bookkeeping. At night, the women sat at tables under bare light bulbs reading or knitting. They listened to the sound of jazz music drifting from the men's compound. They wrote letters home on stationery provided by the Red Cross, careful to avoid any criticism that could be censored. They described their days honestly. The food is good, we are safe, we are treated fairly. Their families found those claims hard to believe until later, when the women returned and repeated them in person. The relationship between the women and the camp commandant evolved over time. He enforced the rules strictly. He inspected the barracks weekly, running his hand along windowsills for dust. He insisted that beds be made to regulation. He authorized punishments that mostly involved restriction of privileges, such as no recreation time or removal from work details. When male prisoners shouted at the women or harassed them from across the fence, he ordered them transferred to different camps. He took reports from the German barracks leader and occasionally met with her to discuss problems. He did not show overt kindness, but he never displayed cruelty. To some of the women, his demeanor was a revelation. They had been taught to fear the enemy. They found that the enemy adhered to a law that even they could respect. They learned that the camp was subject to inspections by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Inspectors arrived without warning, walked through the barracks, checked medical records, tasted the food, and interviewed prisoners without guards present. The inspectors' reports praised the camp for adhering to the Geneva Convention. They noted that prisoners ate the same rations as American soldiers, gained weight, and had access to recreation and education. They also noted that the prisoners had a library, art supplies, and musical instruments. They criticized only minor issues, such as the need for more shade in the exercise yard or the replacement of worn mattresses. These reports reinforced the notion that there was a system greater than the individuals running it, a framework of law and order that restrained abuse. Propaganda had prepared the women for a different reality. During the war, German radio broadcasts warned of the horrors awaiting those captured by the Allies. Posters showed caricatures of enemy soldiers leering at blonde women. The Nazi regime insisted that surrender was dishonorable and that captivity meant defilement. Even late in the war, when defeat was inevitable, officers told their troops that American camps were death traps. Some women considered suicide rather than be taken. Others believed they could hide in civilian clothing and return home. When they were finally captured and told they would be shipped to America, a rumor spread that they would be forced into labor camps in the desert and that they would be used as servants. The phrase, "undress inside," haunted their imagination. Some believed they would be stripped and displayed like animals. Some attempted to sabotage the train car locks. Others cut their hair short, hoping to pass as boys. Nothing they had heard prepared them for a system that emphasized hygiene, medical exams, and orderly intake. Their fear made the order seem surreal. Their relief when they realized that the undressing was for a shower and medical inspection was palpable. They still felt exposed and vulnerable, but the context changed. It was not humiliation, it was a procedure. The daily routine slowly eroded the mental walls built by fear and propaganda. The women learned to trust the consistency of the schedule. They appreciated the predictability of meals, work, and rest. They discovered that discipline could be a form of respect. The camp guards were sometimes stern, but they were fair. They did not hit or shout. They sometimes joked. They asked the women about their homes and their plans for after the war. They talked about their own farms or city neighborhoods. A guard from Texas told the women he had never traveled outside his county until the war. He had been drafted, trained, and then assigned to guard prisoners. He said he hoped to go back to driving cattle. Another guard from New York complained about the heat and missed the cool breezes off the Atlantic. He asked a woman what snow smelled like because he had never seen it. These small conversations humanized both sides. The women began to see the guards not as faceless enemies, but as individuals caught in a vast machine. There were moments of tension. One afternoon, a rumor spread through the camp that the women were going to be transferred to another state. Anxiety rose. Some women feared being separated from friends or from the relative stability of Camp Hearn. Others worried that new camps might be harsher. The camp commandant gathered the women in the mess hall and addressed them through an interpreter. He explained that no transfers were planned. He warned against rumors. He reminded them that any transfer would be announced formally. The women listened. They looked at each other and nodded. The rumor died. On another occasion, a woman was caught stealing extra sugar from the kitchen. She was brought before the German barracks leader, who reprimanded her and reported the incident to the Americans. The punishment was 3 days without access to the camp store. The woman accepted it. She later explained that she had wanted to mail sugar home to her mother, who had none. The barracks leader promised to share her own sugar ration instead. These minor events illustrated how the prisoners maintained their own code of conduct within the larger framework of camp regulations. Outside the wire, the war's aftermath unfolded. News came of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the surrender of Japan. Newspapers delivered to the camp told of the Allied victory celebrations, the start of occupation, and the arrest of Nazi leaders. The prisoners read about the trials scheduled in Nuremberg. They recognized some names. They read with a mixture of anger, shame, and relief. Anger at those who had led them into catastrophe. Shame at the crimes being revealed. Relief that the war was over and that there would be accountability. They also read about food shortages in Germany, the dislocation of millions of refugees, and the destruction of cities. They worried about their families. Camp officials allowed them to send letters home through the Red Cross. The women wrote carefully, describing their treatment, but avoiding political statements. Some letters took months to reach Germany. Some never arrived. When replies came, they described hunger and ruins, fathers missing, brothers killed, homes destroyed. The women realized that the camp, with its regular meals and clean beds, was in some ways more secure than the lives their families were living. As winter approached, the Texas climate cooled. Mornings were crisp. Frost sparkled on the ground before melting in the sun. The camp issued warmer blankets. The women wore sweaters over their uniforms. They looked forward to Christmas with mixed feelings. It would be the first Christmas away from home, away from family. They did not know if they would be repatriated soon. The commandant allowed them to cut a pine branch and decorate it with paper chains made from Red Cross parcels. On Christmas Eve, the women sang carols softly. An American chaplain visited and read from a Bible. The German Catholic and Protestant chaplains among the prisoners held separate services. The women lit candles and placed them in jars. Tears flowed silently as the familiar hymns echoed off the barracks walls. At midnight, the camp band from the men's compound played Silent Night on a trumpet and accordion. For a moment, The fence and the guard towers seemed less oppressive. The shared ritual bridged the gap between captor and captive. In January 1946, the camp commandant announced that repatriation would begin in stages. Allied governments had decided to use German prisoners for labor in Europe to rebuild roads, bridges, and farms. Those who volunteered would be shipped to Britain or France. Others would wait until shipping and logistics allowed for direct transport back to Germany. The women were given forms to indicate their preference. Many volunteered for labor, believing that they could send money home and perhaps expedite their release. The central figure hesitated. She weighed the comfort of the camp against the unknown of a foreign labor assignment. She thought about her family in a ruined city. She thought about her father, missing in action. She signed up for labor in France. She wanted to do something to rebuild instead of waiting passively behind barbed wire. The day of departure arrived. The women packed their few belongings. They were given new uniforms without PW letters, indicating that they would be laborers rather than prisoners. They were issued small envelopes containing wages earned in camp script, converted to French francs. They said goodbye to friends who would remain. The central figure hugged the nurse who had first given her a towel and soap months earlier. She thanked her, not just for the soap, but for the humanity it represented. The nurse smiled and wished her luck. The truck carrying the departing women drove past the guard towers, past the fields where cotton plants had withered in winter, and onto the road leading out of camp. The central figure looked back one last time. She saw the sign for Camp Hearn growing smaller. She saw the silhouette of the guard in the tower. She felt a pang of sadness at leaving a place where she had been imprisoned. She realized that she had grown accustomed to the routines, the fairness, and the sense of safety. She did not know what awaited her. She carried with her the bar of soap, now wrapped in cloth, and the memory of the words she had whispered, "They didn't hate us." That's how they won. Years later, when the central figure had returned to Germany and built a new life, she told her children the story of her captivity in Texas. She described the heat of September, the long lines, the fear. She described the moment she was ordered to undress and how terror gave way to relief when she realized it was a medical exam. She spoke of the routine, the food, the work, the library, and the classes. She told them about the commandant who kept his uniform pressed and his boots polished and who enforced rules without cruelty. She described the Red Cross inspectors with their clipboards. She showed her children the bar of soap, now worn smooth. She kept it as a reminder that in war, humanity can persist. She taught them that victory achieved without hatred is more enduring. She told them that discipline and respect are powerful weapons against ideology. She told them that when she first arrived at Camp Hearn, she thought she would lose her dignity. Instead, she found that dignity was protected by the enemy. She insisted that this was no accident. It was the result of laws, conventions, and conscious decisions by individuals to adhere to them. Historians have since analyzed the treatment of German prisoners in the United States. They note that conditions varied between camps. Some had problems with overcrowding or conflicts among prisoners. However, they conclude that on the whole, German prisoners received decent treatment. They were not starved or abused. They were allowed to practice their religion and maintain their cultural traditions. They were provided with education and recreation. They were paid for their labor. The mortality rate among German prisoners in the United States was low. In Texas, where climate and agriculture allowed for outdoor work year-round, prisoners harvested crops, built irrigation systems, and repaired roads. This labor helped alleviate wartime labor shortages. The presence of German prisoners also affected local communities. Residents of Hearn saw the prisoners working in fields and sometimes interacted with them in town. Children watched them march to work details. Some farmers hired prisoners to pick cotton or harvest fruit. The prisoners saw more of American society and realized that propaganda had misled them. They saw racial segregation. They saw poverty and wealth. They saw women driving tractors and running businesses. They formed a more nuanced view of the enemy. The story of German women at Camp Hearn reveals the complex interplay between fear and order, vulnerability and discipline. These women arrived expecting humiliation and cruelty. They found a system that valued procedure, hygiene, and fairness. They discovered that the enemy's power lay not just in weapons, but in adherence to law. The central figure learned that her captors did not hate her, they followed rules and treated her with dignity. She learned that her humanity was intact. In the end, she carried the lesson with her. She taught it to her children. She told them that when a nation wins a war without resorting to barbarism, it has accomplished more than a military victory. It has affirmed the ideals it claims to defend. Beyond work and classes, the camp offered recreation. A soccer field had been carved out of a dusty patch of land between barracks. Male prisoners played matches on Sundays, while other prisoners cheered from the sidelines. The women rarely joined the games, but they often walked around the perimeter, listening to the shouts and laughter. A group of prisoners built a small theater from scrap wood. They staged plays, some humorous, some serious, using costumes made from old curtains and uniforms. Music filled the camp in the evenings. Men formed a jazz band using trumpets, saxophones, and a drum set provided by the YMCA. The women sometimes sang along from their compound. They learned new songs in English and taught the men German folk songs. Art flourished in unexpected corners. One prisoner carved chess pieces from soap. Another painted landscapes of Texas sunsets with pigments mixed from crushed brick and laundry bluing. Creativity became a form of freedom. It allowed the prisoners to express themselves and escape the monotony for a moment. The commandant encouraged these activities because they kept minds engaged and reduced discipline problems. Ideological tensions simmered beneath the surface. Not all prisoners abandoned the beliefs they had carried into captivity. Some women still admired Hitler and hoped for a resurgence. They whispered about the Führer's last orders and speculated that a new war would begin. They hid portraits of Nazi leaders under their mattresses. They formed small circles that shunned those who questioned the regime. On the other side were women who had lost faith long before surrender. They blamed the leaders for the destruction of Germany. They were curious about democracy and wanted to read books banned at home. Occasionally, these factions clashed verbally. In one incident, a fervent Nazi tore pages from a camp newspaper because it contained criticism of the regime. Other women confronted her. A shouting match ensued. The German barracks leader intervened. She reminded them that divisions among prisoners only harmed themselves. She quoted camp rules about respect and order. The commandant learned of the dispute and decided not to punish anyone. Instead, he organized a debate on the causes of war. A prisoner who had been a history teacher moderated. The discussion was heated, but respectful. It showed that free speech could exist even in a prison. It also showed the complexity of belief. Captivity did not automatically change minds. It created space for reflection. The number of women in American camps was small compared to the hundreds of thousands of male prisoners. Historians estimate that fewer than 3,000 German women were held in the United States, out of more than 400,000 prisoners. Most were members of auxiliary services, such as the Luftwaffe's Communications Corps, the Army's Medical Corps, or civilian agencies connected to the Wehrmacht. Because the Geneva Convention required prisoners to be housed in climates similar to where they were captured, and because the United States wanted to keep men and women separate, these women were distributed to a handful of camps with adequate facilities. Texas, with its many camps, housed more than half of them. Camp Hearn became one of the primary sites. In total, Texas had 70 prisoner of war camps of varying sizes. They dotted the landscape from the Panhandle to the Gulf. Some held Italians, some held Japanese, but the majority housed German men. The presence of women was unusual enough that the camp administration created separate protocols. They assigned female guards to accompany the prisoners to showers and medical exams. They ensured that male prisoners could not access the women's compound. They also recognized that women might have different medical needs and stocked the infirmary accordingly. The system adapted to the unique circumstances without losing its overall discipline. Repatriation was not the end of captivity. When the central figure and her companions left Camp Hearn, they boarded trains once again. This time, the destination was the port of New Orleans. They sailed across the Atlantic and converted troop ships not as prisoners, but as laborers under guard. They landed in France and were taken to camps near Le Havre. There, they received assignments to work on farms, roads, and railroads. They lived in barracks similar to those in Texas, but with European winters and French overseers. They were paid wages and received rations. French civilians sometimes greeted them with hostility, sometimes with indifference. The women worked hard. They harvested sugar beets, repaired bomb craters, and cooked meals for French soldiers. They sent part of their pay to Germany through the Red Cross. They felt a sense of purpose rebuilding instead of fighting. After months of labor, they were finally allowed to return home. The central figure traveled through her home country and saw the ruins with her own eyes. Streets she had played in as a child were now piles of rubble. Her family home had been reduced to a foundation. Her mother lived with relatives. Her father's fate was still unknown. She realized that her experience in Texas had sheltered her from the worst of the war's aftermath. She felt survivor's guilt and gratitude simultaneously. Decades later, long after the central figure had raised a family and grown old, she returned to Texas. She traveled to Hearn with her daughter and grandchildren. The camp no longer existed, but a museum stood on the site. The replica barracks resembled the ones she had lived in. The museum displayed photographs of prisoners marching to work, letters home, and tools carved by prisoners. It displayed a barbed wire section and a guard tower. It showed Red Cross parcels and the script used in camp stores. In one case, the museum displayed a small blue bar of soap with the word "Keep" pressed into it. The The central figure recognized it immediately. She pressed her hand to the glass, tears welling in her eyes. She told her grandchildren how that bar of soap had changed her understanding of the enemy. She showed them the carved chess pieces and explained how prisoners had created beauty from almost nothing. She walked through the rows of bunks and touched the rough wood. She inhaled the faint smell of aged timber and dust and felt transported back to 1945. Her grandchildren listened quietly. They had learned about the war in school, but hearing their grandmother's story made it real. They asked her why she had not told them sooner. She said she needed time to understand it herself. The moral of this story is not confined to one moment in history. It speaks to how societies should treat those in their power. It shows that discipline and law can be expressions of humanity rather than tools of oppression. When the central figure says, "They didn't hate us," that's how they won. She captures an essential truth. Hatred corrodes both the hated and the hater. Order tempered by compassion builds bridges even in the midst of war. The experience of German women at Camp Herne demonstrates that victory can be achieved through restraint as well as through force. It shows that the values embodied in international conventions are not abstract ideals but practical guides that shape lives. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, people can choose to uphold dignity. This lesson remains relevant whenever prisoners are taken, whether in war or in other contexts. The story asks listeners to imagine themselves on both sides of the fence and to choose humanity over vengeance. It asks them to remember the soap, the nurse's calm voice, the doctor's impartial hands, the commandant's even tone, and the discipline that kept violence at bay. It asks them to carry these memories into the future. The narrator returns to the scene at Camp Herne. September 1945. The sun still beats down on the barbed wire. The central figure stands at the gate again, but this time she is leaving. She shoulders her duffel and steps through. The guard salutes. She nods. She glances back at the barracks, at the laundry lines, at the library. She hears the call of a bugle. She smells the cotton fields. She takes a step forward into a world she barely recognizes. Her story becomes one of many that show how war can destroy and war can reveal. The camera pulls back, rising above the camp. The rows of barracks become lines on a grid. The guard towers become dots. The railroad that brought her there stretches toward the horizon. The sky is vast. The voice finishes, "If this story moved you, hit like and comment where you are watching from. We rescue forgotten stories every day.